During the summer of 2020, a woman disappeared mysteriously from the remote wilderness. She was never found and presumed deceased. In spite of this, numerous people have reported seeing her in the area, distorted as they described it. This is the story of Sandra Hughes. Sandra Johnson Hughes, known to her friends as Sandy, loved nature and spending time outdoors. From a young age, she was fascinated by, but also mindful of her surroundings. Though she worked as an accountant during her time in college, she studied wilderness survival and she hoped to fulfill her dreams of becoming a park ranger. With a deep understanding of survivalist skills, thanks to her outdoor experience, she was considered by those close to her as highly skilled and knowledgeable in this field. Throughout most of her life, Sandra lived what some might consider to be a nomadic lifestyle. She frequently moved around the United States, settling for a while before deciding to move and establish a new home somewhere else. Settling down in one place never seemed to be an ideal option for her. Though Sandra married twice in her life, both of them ended in divorce, and she never bore any children. This meant that migrating was less stressful for her. Of course, though, she still had a caring family from Pennsylvania, who she kept in contact with. On March 11th, 2020, the World Health Organization had declared COVID-19 as a global pandemic, and what followed were a series of strict rules focusing on social distancing and quarantines in hopes of reducing the spread of the infection. Sandra, however, had a different idea. Instead of remaining isolated from the outside world, she considered this a perfect opportunity to travel alone and spend time in the wilderness, without anything or anyone holding her back. According to her niece Ashley Marcus, she was described as quarantining in the national forest. At 54 years old, Sandra was living in Maui, Hawaii up until June 2020, when she sold her home and relocated to California. On June 26th, she told her family that she was going on an extended solo camping trip, while also considering hiking to Yosemite if things went well for her. This was not surprising for her family, who were more than familiar with her outdoor expeditions. The plan was to head to Sierra National Forest in Madera County. When she was done in the coming weeks, she would notify her family. So, with all of her camping equipment placed inside of her silver Saab sedan, she headed south before traveling east. Just over an hour later, she arrived at her destination. Deep within, amidst nothing but trees and shrubbery, her trip would finally begin. Initially, she set up camp along the main road. Later, she would then follow a dirt road that wound through the forest. That led her out to an area called the Johnson Meadows, an isolated area located just above the Bass Lake. It was a beautiful location, with snow-capped mountains and luscious, dense wooded areas. At first glance, it seemed like a fantastic place to stay and perhaps explore further. However, as wonderful as it seemed, it was actually dangerous. Not only was it home to predators such as bears and cougars, but it was also known for a plethora of natural hazards. Since it was a fair distance from the rest of the forest, it was unlikely that many people would be passing nearby. If something went wrong, Sandra would be in big trouble. Still, as we know, Sandra had brought her camping gear and her extensive knowledge of the wilderness. She drove to the edge of the meadows and parked off the side of the road. After grabbing her essentials, she commenced her hike and established a campsite located between Minarets Road and Bazemore Road. It was on July 1st, 2020, when a couple of campers had been hiking near Johnson Meadows when they were greeted by an abandoned campsite that appeared to have been destroyed. There were unopened tins of food and personal documents that were strewn about haphazardly, a nearby backpack that seemed to have been emptied, and the tent which had been destroyed. At first glance, it looked as if it had been ransacked, but there were no clear signs as to who or what had done such a thing. Marking the location down on their map, they left and contacted the Madera County Sheriff's Office once they were finally within range with their cell phones. Upon their arrival, deputies searched the campsite and uncovered ID cards belonging to Sandra. With these, they were able to contact her family. The news shocked them. Why would Sandra leave the campsite while leaving all of her belongings scattered around? Ashley Marcus would go on to write about this on Facebook, mentioning that this was simply out of character for her, as she was a clean person who was always concerned for the environment. When the family were informed about the discovery made, they were concerned for Sandra's safety, as they had not heard back from her ever since she had started her trip days ago. There were no clear ideas where she could have been by that point, as she never shared any specifics. So they decided to file a missing persons report and hung posters in nearby towns and businesses in hopes of spreading the word during the hopefully busy tourist season. For 2 days, about 100 people searched Johnson Meadows and the surrounding areas. Tracking dogs were brought in to sniff out any clues of her whereabouts, while helicopters surveyed the land from above. Interviewers were conducted alongside, collecting any relevant information they could piece together. Before setting off on her camping trip, Sandra had dyed her hair a dark shade of blue. This was an easily identifiable physical feature of hers that the search party hoped would make tracking her down a little bit easier. Alas, despite all of their best efforts though, there were no new discoveries. Sandra was still absent, and everyone was more worried than ever for her safety. On July 4th, a pair of hikers took a shortcut through the Johnson Meadows area. According to their accounts, they saw a barefoot woman with blue hair, a black shirt, blue jeans, and a bruise on her face. She did not appear to have any camping equipment in her possession at the time. The woman from afar did not appear to be in any desperate need of help. In fact, she looked as if she was waiting for something. Without thinking much of the sight, they minded their own business and walked on by. When they got to the parking spot, the hikers quickly noticed the missing person flyers and realized the person they saw in the distance may have very well been Sandra Hughes. That blue hair of hers was easily the most distinctive part of her appearance. Following the sighting, the hikers immediately got in contact with the authorities and explained their account. But when deputies looked around for themselves, they found no one. A day later, on July 5th, a significant discovery was made. Sandra's silver Saab sedan was found at the bottom of a ravine located approximately 5 miles north of where her destroyed campsite was in Johnson Meadows, just off Road 5S40, though Sandra's belongings were found scattered across the ground, much like her campsite. Her body was nowhere to be seen. Investigators surveyed the damage on the front of the car. They theorized that Sandra may have been driving on the winding forest road at a low speed before she struck a tree and rolled off the embankment, plunging into the depths of the ravine. There was some reassurance to take away from this. There was no blood found inside the vehicle, nor any evidence that proved that she might have been injured. The damage to the front of the vehicle was minimal at worst. In other words, there was still a chance that she survived the crash. But it seemed that this did not happen without anyone knowing. Numerous eyewitness attempts stepped forward and said that they saw the crash. Despite offering Sandra help, she turned them down and said that she did not need any help. They would go on to say that she did not appear to be injured, and that she waited nearby before heading into the woods alone. According to Sheriff Tyson Pogue, the Madera County Sheriff's Office. We had people came across her, offered assistance. She was, I don't know if despondent is the right word, but she didn't accept help, and in many cases, she kind of just ignored the people and went on. So we don't know really what her mind frame was. We don't know if she had an injury from the accident. Based on all the recent accounts collected, the police considered the possibility that Sandra may have been suffering from a head injury or some kind of disorientation that impaired her ability to ask for help. The only visual clue they had was the aforementioned bruise the witnesses reported. But the question was, had this been a result of the crash or something that occurred back at the campsite? All the police could do was speculate, though there was some thought put into the possibility that she had been a victim of foul play. There was insufficient evidence to back this up, though. A spokesperson for the Madera County Sheriff's Office said, "We have not towed it from the area in case she returns to it. She has been seen on foot by others since her car was located. We are still actively investigating and will be sending our off-highway vehicle teams up there to continue the search." Believing that Sandra would hopefully return to her crashed car at some point, law enforcement wrote a note with a phone number to the sheriff's office, along with the line, "Your family is worried about you." More days passed as the police continued their search of the area near the scene of the crash, yet no new discoveries were made. On the evening of July 12th, a week after the vehicle was discovered, a team of searchers headed about 2.5 miles north of the crash site. Making their way into Yosemite National Park, they headed towards Spotted Lake. It in general was remote, and there were no main trails to get there, meaning it was exceptionally tricky to move around in. Equipped with flashlights, they proceeded to search the area. That's when they discovered a sleeping bag laid out in the middle of the wilderness. But why would anyone have rolled it out in the middle of nowhere? Since it seemed to have been used recently, the search party continued to look around nearby, but found no other clues. One thing was for certain though. It was the exact sleeping bag that Sandra brought. The authorities faced another possibility. Sandra could have been traversing through the rugged terrain away from the trails and roads with no gear. Aside from the sleeping bag, everything else was left at the abandoned campsite left in disarray. The thing was that it was also home to cougars and bears, much like Johnson Meadows. If she had been really sleeping rough in the wilderness, she would have knowingly been putting herself in extremely dangerous territory. Sandra had likely traveled from Johnson Meadows and headed north, almost in a straight line. With no footwear or equipment, she was heading into a rugged area that was notably steep and posed many hazards, ill-prepared for what she might have been heading into. Law enforcement were deeply concerned that something terrible might have happened to her unless she returns. Following the discovery of the sleeping bag, the search pressed on for another week. Yet these efforts were scaled down as there had been no new developments since July 20th. 3 weeks later, on August 9th, two hunters were driving down Road 5S01 near Baysmore Road. The surrounding forest was remote and sparsely populated, so finding another person within eyeshot was unlikely. If they were lucky, they might have spotted an animal or two along the way. But what they were not expecting as they turned around a corner was a blue-haired woman standing on a hillside leaning against a tree. She had no equipment with her, lacked a tent, and was not carrying a backpack. Adding to the mysteriousness was the fact that she was alone. The hunters pulled up nearby and called out to the woman, who was roughly 10 to 15 feet away, standing among the trees. Despite their efforts, it seemed she could have been either unaware of their presence or had been ignoring them. As they continued their trek, they spotted the missing persons posters and said that the woman they encountered earlier must have been Sandra. The hunters got into contact with the Madera County Sheriff's Office and shared their findings. However, there were two details that stood out. She looked notably thinner, and that she was wearing overalls and a floral t-shirt. This was drastically different compared to the July 4th sighting, where she was reported as wearing a black shirt and blue jeans. Considering that all of Sandra's clothes were left behind at the campsite, how could she have been changing her attire? This detail simply did not add up. But it wasn't going to stop the authorities from conducting another search. But once again, there was no sign of Sandra anywhere. Following this, her case went cold. On September 4th, 2020, California was ravaged by the Creek Fire. The incident was so devastating that it affected well over 370,000 acres. It was declared fully contained on December 24th, 2020, but during those months, the fire had greatly affected the landscape, further complicating the search for Sandra. An interesting detail was the fact that even during the fires, the vehicle remained largely unaffected. Nevertheless, once the fire was contained, the police finally decided to tow the vehicle from the location as it was deemed unlikely that she was going to return to it. On Wednesday, July 21st, 2020, 7 months after the Creek Fire had been contained, Jake Gorba was driving his off-roading vehicle up and through a steep forest road in the middle of Sierra National Forest. With him was his wife Victoria and their trio of young children. The next destination was Shut-Eye Peak, a mountain located about 5 miles south from the Johnson Meadows, where Sandra's first campsite was discovered. Shut-Eye Peak was a popular spot for hikers, as it offered breathtaking views from the top. The family were hoping to experience such heights for themselves. Jake continued driving through the ATV trail when their children said that they were hungry. Pulling up in a meadow by some trees, the family got out and got to preparing a delicious picnic. Their 3-year-old son, Caden, was sitting in the back seat of the vehicle near a window. As they prepared their lunch, the family overheard Caden talking to himself. Caden appeared to be speaking to someone through the window, almost as though he were having a conversation with someone in the forest. When the parents rushed over to see who he was talking to, no one was there. Chillingly, Caden then said, "There's a woman out there. She needs our help." The incident was so disturbing that the family decided to head home and end the camping trip early, but not without letting people know about this story. Victoria made a Facebook post about what happened at Shut-Eye Peak, which prompted the Madera County Sheriff's Office later that night. Requesting more information, the family agreed to rendezvous with the Gorba family to get to the bottom of this. Caden pointed to the area where he supposedly spoke to the woman. When the parents asked for more details, Caden remained fixated towards the same area, saying, "She's lying face down. Her legs are straight up. She's dead." However, they did not find anyone. He said the woman had blue hair, a black shirt, and blue jeans, which sounded exactly how eyewitnesses described Sandra after her accident. The police even showed Caden a selection of photos of missing women, and even though he was not given any context, he pointed to 3 specific photographs. All 3 were Sandra Hughes. 2 Madera County Sheriff's deputies went back to the meadow along with Jake and Caden, and they conducted a search. Yet no discoveries were made. After over 6 years since Sandra's disappearance, the authorities are still perplexed. Was it foul play, or was she killed by wildlife? Did she willingly head into the forest, or were her decision-making skills clouded by a supposed injury from the crash? And how can anyone explain the surprisingly accurate description given by little Caden? Unfortunately, the question outnumbers the answers, and the world may never know what really happened to Sandra. Sheriff Tyson Pogue of the Madera County Sheriff's Office would weigh in on the incident, saying, "I think all of us hold out hope that maybe somehow she's alive out there. I don't think the evidence supports that. It's been a long time without any sightings during the search time." Despite the lack of updates in recent years, Sandra's family remain hopeful that they will get their answers and closure they so desperately need.